Joe Abernathy's wife knew about his cross-dressing from their third date. Susan said she was not bothered by it. She let him do it from time to time. Joe knew her previous boyfriends were effeminate. Susan never liked the man's man, John Wayne type. To Joe, Susan often seemed more accepting of his cross-dressing than he was. Joe had an androgynous appearance in his youth that was amplified by his long hair. Susan playfully threatened to divorce him if he got a man's haircut when he said he was thinking about cutting it a few years after they married. Joe had gotten the misstatement from people behind me and from afar when they did not have good eyesight, before he turned or moved closer to them and they caught the stubble he deliberately left on his face. The stubble kept any questions of his gender away. He only fully shaved on the weekends or on vacations when he was going to be dressing up. Joe's appearance was often a sore spot with his father. The domineering industrialist often complained that he had a hippie son who did not live more than a year of his life in the 1960s. Despite the man's complaints, upon his death, Joe inherited his father's empire. Joe was already married at the time and had worked closely with his controlling father. Joe's father had a bit of an affinity for his daughter-in-law. Often believing that his son had married someone out of his league and better suited for leadership, he was relieved by Joe's marriage. Indeed, the old man saw more of himself in his daughter-in-law than in his son. Joe's father knew that Susan called the shots in her relationship with his son. At first that bothered him, but as he realized what a good steward the woman was of his shamefully weak son, he accepted it. Joe knew that the reason the father had left the company in his care was because of Susan. Joe and Susan both knew his father believed that Susan would run it through his son. Joe knew that his father was right. He never refused his wife anything. She made the calls at the business and it grew even beyond the behemoth he inherited. Susan put in long hours at the corporate offices. To outsiders, Joe Abernathy, the soft-spoken, thin man that was the public face of a faceless international conglomerate, ran the business. The higher-ups inside knew that within Joe's executive's office, Susan made the decisions. Joe was merely her puppet with which she ruled with an iron fist. Joe was credited by outsiders as a visionary. Insiders knew he was little more than his wife's assistant. Joe was aware of the impression held by the insiders. He had heard his employees and board members reference Susan as she who must be obeyed and refer to him as Severin. After the company bought a hotel near their residence, Joe stepped down from his executive's position, and his henchman on the board appointed Susan to replace him. Joe's stated reason for retiring was a desire to travel. However, the real reason was known to Susan. She and Joe had planned the whole thing for 2 years. She had been pulling the strings on Joe for 20 years and, now, she was ready to take the visual role on. Joe was more than happy to let her take the company in her iron fist in exchange for the job at the hotel she was offering him. The thought of being a hotel maid excited Joe. He had long served Susan in the confides of their mansion after the servants had been dismissed for the night. Only their live-in maid knew of Joe's fetish. Roberta was paid handsomely by the Abernathy's for her silence and training of Joe. Joe spent many a late night scrubbing and dusting with his maid while his wife lounged about. Other than his wife, Roberta was the only person who Joe trusted. He and his wife knew she would keep her silence. Roberta's loyalty to Susan mimicked Joe's. Susan was a kind mistress to both of them. She favored Roberta to the displeasure of the rest of the staff. Roberta in turn reported all their misdeeds to Susan. Roberta knew that one word to Susan and any other employee would be gone. For a woman of her status, it was a unique power. The others eventually figured it out, and they started to treat her as they treated Susan and Joe. Joe and Roberta grew close in a platonic way. At first, Roberta was befuddled and amused by Joe's sexual desires. She believed that Susan used Joe's fetish for her own enjoyment. Roberta laughed at him the first time she saw him in a maid's outfit. However, her initial judgments about Joe fell by the wayside as she trained him over the years. She liked having such a willing student by her side. Roberta loved being able to scold her employer for his improper actions. She knew she would not get in any trouble since both Joe and Susan seemed to enjoy her dominance over him. That dominance was not lost on the rest of the staff. They saw how Joe looked at his maid with a peculiar reverence. They knew of it, but they never dared to speak of it in the home. They saw the affection Roberta had for Joe too. It was never a sexual desire. Roberta was never attracted to a man in a dress, but there was affection for him inside her. Roberta saw her slightly older employer as the little sister she never had. Joe in fact looked up to her and felt as if she was the sibling he had never had. In many dark hours, they served Susan's every whim. Joe became quite proficient at domestic work. Roberta and Susan both delighted in his attention to detail as he cleaned the home in the pink French maid's outfit that Susan required he wear when he worked around the home. Now, the planning and training was all coming to an end. Joe's company had purchased a hotel on the other side of the city known as the Palace. The famed Art Deco building was a city landmark and yet another feather in the corporation's considerable cap. The ornate structure was erected during the height of the Roaring Twenties and had every detail that Joe and Susan wanted for Joe's place of employment. The separate servants' entrance was a selling point for them. They knew that Joe would enter through the dank servants' entrance, while Susan would walk into the lobby decorated by silver works, paintings, frescoes, and murals. Now, the deal was done and only formalities were left before Joe took his place at the hotel. One evening, Joe realized that the formalities were dealt with. Susan sent all the servants home early that night except Roberta. Joe and Roberta made dinner for Susan while eating their own dinner on their feet. After making her dinner and serving it to her, Susan asked Joe to join her in the living room when he finished with the dishes. As he finished cleaning up with Roberta, she hugged him and said, "Good luck in there. When you get to the hotel, just remember what I taught you, and you'll be fine." Joe thanked her and dried his hands. Joe walked into the living room and saw 2 pieces of paper on the coffee table. Susan motioned for him to sit next to her. Joe sat next to her and watched Susan cross her long lean legs as she twirled her hair. Joe was still mystified by her beauty. Her light brown hair, slender features and self-assuredness that attracted Joe in the first place were still endearing to him. While she had a few lines on her face, minor cosmetic work kept her looking like the trophy wife she played in public. Susan held a pen in her hand and said, "I need you to sign these 2 documents, Joe." "What are they?" Joe asked. Susan pointed at the table and said, "That one authorizes you to undergo some cosmetic changes to facilitate your ability to work at the hotel as a maid undetected. The other one is a contract with the hotel to perform housekeeping services there for a year." "A year?" "Yes. I can do that with ease, Susan." Susan smiled and said, "I think you'll find it's not as easy as you think, but think whatever you want." Joe put his tights-covered knees together and asked, "What kind of cosmetic changes will I be undergoing?" Susan said, "Don't worry about it. It's all temporary. They attach fake boobs and the like. It's all prosthetic to help you pass more easily. They're going to make you look like any other maid at the hotel." The thought of being just one of the many maids at hotel caused Joe to become aroused. Joe took hold of the contract with the transformation clinic, and Susan handed him the pen. Joe put his signature on the line and picked up the employment contract. Joe read the simple contract before him. The terms were clear, and his choice was stark. He was to be paid minimum wage and to work 56 hours a week split over 7 workdays. If he didn't sign, he would stay the titular head of multinational corporation. However, the thought of being a maid was too overpowering for Joe to resist. Joe smiled as he signed the contract, thinking the employment contract would be unenforceable between them as a married couple without ever thinking that the contract was really between him and the hotel. Joe handed the contract back to her with a smile. Susan took hold of it and put in her briefcase with the other contract. She smiled at Joe and said, "I'm glad you signed because I've got big plans for you, baby." Susan made all the arrangements for Joe. She set up his apartment for him and his employment with the hotel. Before Joe started, he first had to go through training and a cosmetic transformation. When Joe arrived at the clinic, he decided he wanted to gain some weight. He always found hotel maids to be a little chubby and figured it would ease his fitting in. The clinic was happy to oblige him. Over the following week, Joe was nearly force-fed fatty foods as he learned basic hotel housekeeping. He practiced making beds and fixing the toilet paper just right. His cleaning skills were already advanced, so there was little done to train him on it. Joe's eyebrows were thinned and given a girlish arch. His makeup skills were already developed, so no training was provided there either. His hair was given a permanent wave. Joe had to fight off an erection every time he saw his slightly curled hair in the mirror. Joe grew embarrassed when his body hair was waxed off. He felt pain from the pulling on his skin and ripping out of his hair. Despite the pain, he also had a full erection. The waxer could not help but tease Joe. "Like a little pain, huh?" "No," Joe answered. The waxer smiled as she pulled another strip off as Joe shouted in pain. The waxer leaned over Joe and said, "I guess you just like being smooth like a girl." Joe blushed and nodded before another strip was ripped off. When the last day came, Joe had prosthetic breasts, nose and chin placed onto him. Special makeup was applied to make it look as if the prosthetics were naturally part of him. Joe kept looking in the mirror and seeing how womanish he looked for the waist up. The slightly chubby girl stared back at him, mimicking his expression, making clear to Joe that this was no illusion. Joe realized that he really was going to be a hotel maid for a year. Joe looked at the artificial vagina before it was placed onto his body. He felt his penis being tugged and situated inside it. Joe thought to himself, a year of squatting. He smiled as makeup was applied around the prosthetic vagina. When they finished, Joe was dressed in a simple black house dress, nude pantyhose and a pair of cheap black, flat sandals. As Joe was led to the door, he was given a pocketbook containing an identification card and all things that a woman of his status would possess. There was cheap makeup in the bag, house keys, a change of pantyhose and cheap pink and black, plastic sunglasses. There was also a plain wallet containing $100. A member of the staff brought Joe outside. He was a little blinded by the sunlight, so he put on the sunglasses. He saw a cab coming to a stop at the curb. The driver called for him to get in the car. Joe got in the cab and found out it was a fake taxi owned by the clinic. Joe was dropped off in front of his apartment and told his apartment number. Joe walked up to the apartment that his wife had rented for him. A part of him wondered if his wife was in there, dying to see how he looked. However, he knew that was a foolish thought. His wife was the type of woman who would never be caught on the wrong side of town. Susan was fashionable in everything she did, so Joe knew that she would never step foot in the apartment building. Joe unlocked the door and headed into his apartment. He looked at the empty walls and the single, moldy love seat and folding table that made up the living room furniture, besides the 20-inch television resting on a small stand. Joe walked into the kitchen and saw the discolored doors of the cabinets and the damaged linoleum tile upon the floor. He laughed as he thought about how different his surroundings were from his palatial home. He looked in the cabinets and noticed that food had been bought for him. The refrigerator also had food and drinks in it. Joe looked at a note that was sitting on the small eating table in the area next to the kitchen. Joe picked up the note and found out his wife had sent him his initial groceries. Joe was happy about that given the limited amount of funds he had. Joe peered into the bathroom and saw the grimy tiles and tub. He was a little turned off by its uncleanly appearance, but it excited him to be in an apartment that fitted his new role in society so perfectly. Joe walked into the bedroom and saw the full-size bed and dresser. He opened up the dresser drawers and found nothing but bras, nude pantyhose and a nightie. Joe realized that he did not have any panties. He only had pantyhose. It was all the same type the hotel required him to wear. He went into the closet and found nothing but uniforms and one cotton, plain gray house dress. He looked on the floor, and he saw that he had nothing but several pairs of the identical white sneakers required by his job. Joe walked over to his single-end table and set his alarm for the next morning. Joe knew that the next morning would bring new challenges he could not wait to deal with. Joe woke up to the sound of his alarm clock. He turned it off and headed for the showers. When he finished showering, he dressed in his uniform. It was a simple gray dress with a white apron. He put on his nude pantyhose and soft-soled white sneakers before taking hold of his cap. He placed the cap into his pocketbook and walked into the kitchen to grab a quick breakfast. Joe finished and washed his bowl by hand before he headed out the door. It was a warm day, and he walked down the street wearing nothing more than his uniform. No one really gave him a second look. After all, everyone had seen custodial staff at one time or another. Joe walked to the bus stop and leaned against the signpost while he awaited his bus. The bus came to a stop as Joe smelled the scent of burning diesel. The doors opened to the side, and he stepped onto a bus for the first time in 20 years. He looked for an open seat and sat next to a young woman in a pantsuit. He sat there in silence as the bus made its way down its route. Joe saw his stop approaching when he noticed the hotel nearby. Joe stepped off the bus and walked down the street. Joe walked towards the hotel and headed for the servants' entrance. He walked in, but he found the door locked. He knocked on the door, and a security guard walked towards the door and let him in. The guard directed him to his supervisor's office. Joe and the woman exchanged hellos as the woman went about setting up Joe's card. While the woman authorized the key card, she said to Joe, "Do you have any questions while you wait?" "No, ma'am," Joe answered. The woman shook her head and said, "Don't call me ma'am. Just call me Ms. Winters. Okay?" "Yes, Ms. Winters," Joe replied as he began to feel excited. As she finished with the card, she looked up at Joe and said, "You look like you've got a strong back." "That's good. You're going to need it here anyway. Here's your pass key. Since you're inexperienced, you're going to be cleaning the rooms on the lower floors. Even though you're new, we still expect you to do at least 15 rooms during your shift. Here's a list of the rooms to clean. There's a checklist with what you have to do on the back. The ones that have already checked out are these," she said as she pointed out the starred rooms. Joe reached out and took the key card from the girl. He asked, "Where do you keep the supplies?" The woman directed Joe to where he could find his service cart. Joe walked into the storeroom and saw the cart. He took hold of it, brought it to the laundry area, and filled it with 15 clean linens and towels. He took cleaning supplies from a shelf in the room and placed them in the cart. Joe went to push the cart and found it was much heavier than he expected. Joe gave it a hard initial push and got it moving. Joe pushed his heavy cart towards the service elevator and pressed the button for the second floor. Joe pushed his cart off the elevator and hit the first room. Knowing the guest had already signed out, Joe swiped his keycard to enter the room. Joe walked in and moved towards the bed. He stripped the bed and replaced the quilted bedspread and linens. He neatly placed the pillows into their cases before turning to tucking the blanket and top sheet under the mattress. Joe took out the antibacterial cleaner from the cart and wiped down the desk, chair arms and end tables in the room. He then headed for the bathroom. He scoured the tiles, tub and toilet of the cheapest hotel room of the hotel he owned. As the magnitude of the physical drudgery set in, Joe began to feel excited. Joe finished with the tub and dropped to his hands and knees. Joe scrubbed the marble floor on his hands and knees. He felt the dampness on his nude pantyhose and pulled down at the back of his dress. Joe finished and stood back up and grabbed a new roll of toilet paper. He placed it on the roller and deftly folded the end of into a V as he knew the hotel required. Joe then changed the towels and went to remove the vacuum from the cart. He vacuumed the room as swiftly as he could before he placed it back on the cart. He left the room and headed for the next one. He knocked 3 times upon the door and waited for an answer. Receiving only silence, he walked into the room and started over again. As Joe went about repeating the same tasks as the prior room, he thought about how badly his body would hurt after repeating the same monotonous motions 15 times over 8 hours. After cleaning a few more rooms, Joe got to take his lunch at midday. He headed down to the staff cafeteria where the hotel provided its employees with a free lunch. Joe saw a number of others dressed in the same uniform as him. He asked if he could sit with them, and they permitted it. Joe introduced himself as Mia to the girls. The girls introduced themselves, and Joe started to chat with them. Joe smiled as the women exchanged horror stories with him about cleaning rooms with used condoms and blood on the mattress. Joe talked about cleaning with the women, but they were not as enthused about the subject as he was. For Joe it was a desire, for them it was simply a job. The girls talked more about their kids than the job. Joe listened to them anyway to get into their good graces. When the conversation shifted to rude guests, Joe perked up. He had not dealt with one yet and kind of wanted to. He had been talked down to by his parents, Roberta and Susan, but never a stranger. It would be such an alien feeling, he figured. They finished up eating before they went their separate ways. Joe left the cafeteria and pushed his cart back to the servants' elevator. He went back to his floors to continue his duties. Joe kept cleaning without incident until he reached his 14th room. Tired, he looked around the messy room. He saw the clothes strewn across the floor, the 2 beds were torn apart. Various papers cluttered the desk and end tables. He looked into the bathroom and saw hair shavings in the sink. Joe sighed and got to work. He moved each paper and cleaned under them before carefully putting them back where they were found. He stripped the beds and changed the linens before varying his work by vacuuming before cleaning the bathroom. He vacuumed around the clothes on the floor, careful to pick them up for a short while as he vacuumed beneath them before putting them back down. Joe went into the bathroom and did his normal work. He found that the toilet was in need of a thorough scrubbing to remove the stains that had accumulated in the bowl. Joe began to think about what he was doing. He was scrubbing another's excrement residue off a toilet he indirectly owned. Joe thought about his wife. She was probably sitting in his office in his executive's chair and reading papers or ordering someone around while he had his hands in latex gloves in toilet. Susan was receiving the treatment he once did. She was an executive, respected and feared. He was now a hotel maid in damp pantyhose. Joe left the room exhausted and headed for the last room. He knocked and received an answer. The woman let him in. Joe walked in and cleaned the room with substantially less vigor than he had earlier. Joe began to realize that his fantasy would be no walk in the park. Even with his developed skill for it, Joe was hitting a wall. He realized that it was much harder than cleaning his home. The woman who had slipped into the bathroom came back out and pulled Joe over to the bathroom. He looked at the drenched floor and dirted sink. The woman said, "I need you to clean it up." Joe nodded and went to his cart. He was back on the floor in no time. He felt weary as he cleaned up the woman's mess. Joe finished the room and brought the cart back down to the basement. He put it in the storage area and clocked out for the night. He walked to the nearby bus stop and sat on the bench alongside strangers. Joe stepped on the bus and sat amongst the passengers in total anonymity. He thought back to the last time he left his job. He was taken home in a limo by himself. Now he was in cramped quarters sitting alongside a homeless person and children. He reached his stop and got off. He walked back to his apartment and started dinner. After he ate, he watched television for a brief period before turning in for the night. He set his alarm again and put his head down on his pillow. Within minutes, he was sound asleep. Every other day that week was the same for Joe. The routine never varied. Joe still enjoyed it, but every day seemed to take a little bit of it away. The initial thrill of being one of the housekeepers of his own hotel grew less intense. It still excited him, but not at the level it had when he first started or when it had been only in his fantasies. The following Monday, however, Joe was hit with a change. Ms. Winters called him into her office. He feared that he had done something wrong, but he was instead surprised to hear her sing his praises. Ms. Winters said, "Your services have been fantastic. You're the best we've had around here in a while. As such, you're being tasked with an important room today. We're cutting you down to 10 rooms today because one of the rooms you've got is so massive and important." "What is it?" "You're cleaning the suite at the top of the hotel. It's gigantic. It's going to take you a while, and it has to be perfect." "Why, Ms. Winters?" "The boss is coming today. I don't think she'll be there when you're there. Her company just bought this place. I and the other managers here want to make the best impression possible on her. Do you understand?" "Yes, Ms. Winters." "Good, here's your list for the day." Joe took the list and got to work. Later, as he went between rooms to clean, he saw Susan walking alongside the hotel's manager down the hallway. Susan gave him a brief, probing glance before turning her eyes elsewhere. Joe felt that he was invisible to her now. That thought brought back the initial rush he got when he cleaned the rooms. After lunch, he finished the rest of the rooms and left the suite for last. Joe went into the elevator and hit the button. He exited the elevator and walked towards the suite's door. Joe went into the top suite of the hotel. Joe quickly realized that no one was currently in the suite. He relaxed a little and walked through the ornate suite with his cart. He cleaned it like he had every other room. As he went to scrub the toilet, he heard footsteps behind him. Joe quickly looked upon and saw Susan staring down at him. His wife stared down at him with approving eyes. Joe caught the look and smiled as he cleaned the bathroom toilet. Susan looked around and said, "I see you do good work, girl. I'm glad I've got someone like you at home," with a wink. Joe took his eyes off the bowl and asked, "What are you doing here?" "I'm Susan Abernathy. I own this hotel." Let me just say that's not a very proper form of a question to your superior. Is it? "No, ma'am," Joe said as Susan examined him from head to toe. "Why don't you ask in a manner more suitable for someone of your position?" Joe nodded and said, "I'm sorry. How may I help you, madam? Are you in need of directions or assistance?" "No, my girl. I'm fine. Thanks for asking. I'm just checking out my hotel's amenities. I'm staying here tonight, and I might stay here from time to time after that." Joe grinned as he thought about what Susan might have planned for him. He figured that she must have realized it was him. "Well, I'll let you get back to work," she said as she walked away with a grimace as she thought, "Damn, I really wanted it to be him. I'll have to find out who he is later so I can rub his nose in it." Joe nodded and finished up with the bathroom. He then went back down to the basement and clocked out. Joe headed home with a weary feeling. He began to second-guess himself. "Am I really up to this?" he wondered. He took the bus home and opened the door. Joe walked over to his phone and noticed a message. It was from Susan. She was ordering him to come back to the hotel to her suite. Joe picked up his pocketbook and headed back out the door. Joe walked into the hotel and was pulled aside by Ms. Winters, who was by the door talking to a security guard. She scolded him for using the front door. "But I'm not on duty," Joe protested. Ms. Winters calmly retorted, "When you're in this building, you're always on duty." Joe apologized. "I'm sorry, Ms. Winters. It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't, Mia. It won't. I swear." "Good, now, the boss is expecting you. We set up a cart for you to clean her room." "But I already cleaned it today." "Yes, but the owner, Mrs. Abernathy by the way, insists that she wants it cleaned twice. She said you did a good job, but she kind of wants to evaluate you. She said she's looking for the girl she wants to clean her room every time she comes here." "I understand," Joe said with a smile. "Good, now, go get your cart and get to work." "Yes, Ms. Winters," Joe replied. Joe walked down the stairs to the basement. He took hold of his cart and went to the servants' elevator again. He pressed the button for the top floor and wondered if Susan would be there waiting for him. Joe walked slowly out of the elevator as it reached its floor. He knocked 3 times on the door of the top suite. Hearing no response, he walked into the room. He opened the door and brought in the cart when he saw Susan sitting on the couch and staring at him. "Susan!" Joe exclaimed, in mock surprise at seeing her. He figured she knew and was simply exploiting him. Susan gave him a peeved look and said, "Excuse me?" Joe corrected himself immediately. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Abernathy. You're forgiven. Don't let me get in your way," Susan said with a smile as she observed her husband. Susan blurted out, "I'm surprised they made you so fat." Joe blushed and said, "You know? Of course. I didn't at first. I looked up the newest maid and sure enough it was you. You did good work, Mia." "Mia?" Joe said. "That's your name right now?" "Well, yes, but it feels weird having you." "Having me what?" "I'm your superior, Mia. I can call you whatever I want, you frumpy little wench." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Abernathy. How long are you staying here?" Joe asked. "Not long, Mia. I'm just visiting a friend." "A friend?" Joe said before he saw Brianna walking out of the bedroom in a skirt suit. Joe blushed as Brianna looked him over. He did not say a word to her and walked into the bedroom to change the linens. He went about cleaning the bedroom part before turning his attention to the bathroom. When he was finished, he went out to the front room to see if he could clean the room. Susan nodded and headed off to the bathroom while Joe cleaned up the suite's living room. Brianna watched him intently. Susan exited the bathroom and saw Joe cleaning the table in front of Brianna. Brianna watched Joe as he meticulously cleaned and dusted the table. She looked over to Susan and said, "He's very good at this. You're just noticing that now." "He's been cleaning my house for years," Susan said as Joe began to vacuum. "Well, I never really paid that much attention. That's for the help after all." Susan smirked and said, "She's the best help around. You don't notice her because she's so good. That's the trick with good help. You only notice them when they screw up." "Yes, I know. I'd like to hire her." "What?" Susan said as she put down her cup. "I'd like to have her at my place. I need another maid, and she's very good. Do you think I could persuade you and her to receive her services?" "What do you mean? Like once a week?" "No. I want her full time." "Oh, I can't do that. She's signed a contract with my company." "Oh, we can get around that with a novation. Get her over here and the 3 of us can agree to transfer your company's rights and obligations regarding her services to me." "I don't think so. I don't think she'll go for it," Susan said as she tried to stall. "She'll do it if you tell her to." "That's a docile girl out there," Brianna retorted. Susan knew she was right, but was afraid to admit it. She was thinking about letting Joe go, but it all seemed a little much. What could happen in 10 months at Brianna's? She wondered. Susan decided against it, but she decided to play with her husband. "Mia, can you come in here?" Susan called. "Yes, Madam," Joe answered as she placed down her rag and walked towards the living room. She entered the room and stood ready for Susan's inspection. Susan cleared her throat and said, "Mia, Ms. Jones has made an offer on you." Joe looked at her with a confused look. "She would like to hire you, dear." Joe's eyes grew wide as he felt a bit distressed. He looked to Brianna, who smiled and said, "I need a new maid and I think you would be perfect for my staff. Your work is top of the line." Joe smiled and thanked her for compliment. Brianna continued and said, "I've offered your employer $30,000 for your services. That's more than enough to cover your replacement here at the hotel for the next 11 months. However, we will need your signature for the transfer to go through." Joe's head started to spin. He was going to be bound by the contract to Brianna for 10 months if he signed. That contract would certainly be binding on him. He would be trapped working as a domestic among her staff. He knew she had at least one other maid, and last time he was there he met her butler. Joe shook his head and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Jones, I can't. I know you have staff, and I'm sure they would find out about me very quickly." "Oh, don't worry about that. I'd tell them up front that you're a cross-dressing maid, and if they figure out that they served you on the occasion, all the better, I say." Joe felt a raging sensation in his pantyhose. His members struggled to get hard as he thought about working amongst those that once served him. It would be a dream, but he knew there would be a cost. He looked at Susan. She looked at him with a mix of concern and interest. He knew that she was as concerned about the unintended consequences of this as he was. He decided the best course was to ask her. He looked to Susan and asked, "What would you like me to do, madam?" Susan swallowed hard and had trouble speaking the words, but finally managed to say, "Accept it." Joe felt crushed. Susan was interested in selling his services. She was ridding herself of him from her corporate capacity just as she had from her personal capacity. Joe was dejected, but he felt love for her. He felt he should not hold her back any longer. He looked to Susan and said, "Ms. Jones, Susan interjected, "I'm just messing with you, Mia. I would never sell you away. I've got too many plans for you. Now, go finish cleaning up." Joe walked away, stunned by his wife's cavalier cruelty. The next day, Joe found out some of her plans for him. When he came to work, Ms. Winters pulled him aside and said, "Mrs. Abernathy wants to speak you in her suite." Joe nodded and headed for the elevator. He got off and knocked upon the suite's door. His wife let him and sat him down on the couch. Susan sat across from Joe and said, "Joe, I have made a decision that affects you." "What is it?" Joe hurried to ask as he wondered if his absence had resulted in a self-realization for Susan. Susan answered, "I have decided that I want you to move back in with me." "You want me to give up being a maid?" "No, Joe. You signed your contract, and you're obliged to keep your word." "Well, what do you want me to do?" "I want you to continue working at the hotel and then come home and live with me." "So you want me to just change where I sleep at night?" "No. Joe, I want you to give help to Roberta in the evenings after work." Joe began to realize what she was telling him. Joe asked, "Do you want me to be your maid?" "Yes. I want you to come home in the evening and be my maid. We can set you up in the quarters with Roberta. We have another room available, you know." "But you're an employee of my company." "I know, but me hiring you for the evenings is not a conflict of interest. I'm sure you can perform both jobs satisfactorily." "That's not what I am worried about," Joe said as his voice grew louder. Susan stood up and said, "I will not have the help speaking to me in an insolent tone." "Yes, Susan. I'm sorry." Susan shook her head and corrected Joe, "It's Mrs. Abernathy, Mia." Joe nodded and said, "I'm sorry. So we're all set then." "Yes, Mrs. Abernathy. You know, on second thought, I'd prefer to be called Madam." "Yes, Madam," Joe responded. "Good. Now, there's one other thing I wanted to tell you, but it's slipping my mind." Joe stared at his wife as she clicked her fingers trying to remember what she wanted to tell him. "Oh, yes," she blurted out. "I had all your records destroyed, so you're only going to be Mia going forward." Joe looked at her strangely and said, "That doesn't make any sense. I have my fingerprints, dental records, and DNA. There's a whole bunch of stuff beyond your control. They'd be able to ascertain who I was quick enough even if I have a false identity and no paperwork." "Yes, that's true, but you'd have to go public dressed as a woman to prove it. I'm sure the papers would not be that interested in the former head of an international conglomerate prancing around his hotel in a maid's uniform. Of course you could just try to work long enough to pay for the cosmetic changes to be undone, but that would take you many years." Joe's mouth dropped as he realized that Susan really had him where she wanted him. How could I be this stupid, he thought. Susan continued, so, Mia, you'll be working at my house during your evenings from now on. Are we clear? Joe grabbed his head as his false life was collapsing around him and creating a prison cell. Joe looked for an escape, but his frantic mind could not find one. Joe relented and submitted to his fate. The next evening, movers came for Joe's stuff. Susan directed the movers' actions. Joe figured Susan would drive him to her home, but a taxi arrived out front for him. Joe looked back at Susan as she waved goodbye to him. Joe was distraught. There was no turning back. He was hurting over his upturned his life. With a few strokes of a pen, he had become powerless to do anything to control it. Joe was put up in the servants' quarters. His stuff was brought down into one of the 3 bedrooms in that area. Only Roberta's had ever been used. Now, there would be 2 live-in domestics. Joe unpacked it and went to see Susan when he finished. Susan looked him over and ordered her 3 other indoor servants to meet Mia. Susan introduced Roberta, Holmes, the butler, and Paul the chef to Mia. Joe introduced himself to them. Holmes examined Joe. There was an odd familiarity about the apparent girl standing before him. It was something in the eyes. It dawned on Holmes, and he turned to Susan. Susan smiled and nodded. Holmes exclaimed, "Mr. Abernathy?" Mia blushed. Roberta smiled at his humiliation, which only served to deepen it in Joe. Susan responded, "Yes, Holmes. Mia was once Mr. Abernathy, but he's a domestic now." "And such a pretty one," Roberta chimed in. Joe blushed again and Susan said, "Okay, introduction time is over. Mia, you are to report to Holmes. He operates this place, and he is your superior. He will give you your orders. Do not talk to me about them. You don't speak to me unless you are spoken to. Holmes is the only servant permitted to speak to me besides Roberta. Is that clear?" "Yes, madam." "Good girl. Now, obey Holmes' orders as if they are my own." Joe nodded and Susan turned and walked away. Paul gave Joe an odd look and walked away in silence. Roberta dismissed herself to finish her cleaning. Holmes examined Mia and said, "Quite a fall, Mr. Abernathy. Would you care to explain?" "It's nothing much, Holmes. I just like to do this. It's my passion. Cleaning and debasing yourself are your passion. I'm glad you are here then. Now, you'll get all debasement you'd ever want. I'm going to run you ragged. Looking at you in that dress, it's clear you didn't deserve your position among our elite, so I'm going to make you earn your position as a drag. Start by cleaning the servants' bathroom. The cleaning materials are in that closet," Holmes said as he pointed to 2 doors. Joe nodded and walked towards them. He knew more about the house than Holmes given his cleaning. Holmes watched him take out the supplies and saw him open the bathroom door. Joe nearly gagged. "I had beans for lunch," Holmes replied before he ordered Joe into the room. Joe entered the bathroom and flushed the toilet before cleaning it. It did little to help the stench. Joe's mind began racing as he realized what he had gotten himself into. This was not going to be the sexual thrill a minute it was with his wife ordering him about. It was going to be arduous, humiliating work. It would be worse than his work in anonymity at the palace. Still, something about that made it feel alluring to him. Joe finished the bathroom and headed out to look for Holmes. Holmes ordered him to do the laundry next. After Joe finished putting Susan's whitewash in the washer, he started to hand wash her delicates in the laundry room sink. He had done it many times before at Susan or Roberta's request, but it seemed different now. Joe realized that he was simply a domestic in the eyes of the staff and Susan. He was not the master of the house with a fetish. He was a maid. He was the junior servant in his mistress's house. As Joe finished hanging the underwear to dry, he saw Roberta hovering around him. "Roberta?" he called out. Yes, Mia, she responded with a pause, careful to call him by his new name. Do you know when Susan decided on this? I'm afraid not. I was a bit surprised to see you here. I figured it would be a year before I had my little helper back. Joe smiled at her treatment of him. She was still the same Roberta to him. Joe went to speak further, but Roberta cut him off, saying that she had to get back to work. Joe nodded and reported to Holmes. Holmes said, "Your new work is done for the night. The heavy lifting was done while you were prancing about your mistress's hotel in pansy cleaning clothes, you stupid cow." Joe looked at Holmes with a startled expression frozen on his face. Holmes grinned and said, "Now, you're free to make yourself dinner and take a load off until it's time to get those clothes in the dryer. That's all you have to do for the night. You have to finish the laundry. On second thought, I guess I had better clarify that the task includes ironing it and putting it away. You're new anyway, so I guess I had better give you detailed instructions so you can't play the dumb maid on me, as if I would fall for it." Joe nodded and headed to the kitchen. He looked around and noticed that Paul had gone home for the night. That's one conversation I got out of, Joe thought. Joe went to the fridge before turning on the stove. He made himself a small dinner and ate it before he headed back to the laundry room. He put the clothes in the dryer before heading down to the servants' quarters to kill time. He put on the television he had given Roberta when Susan purchased a new one for their bedroom. When enough time had passed, Joe went back up and finished his wife's laundry. He ironed it and headed into his former bedroom. Joe paused as he looked around at the room he had once shared with her. He felt like a stranger there now. The Susan he had wed seemed alien to the one that now possessed the room. He felt a shiver as he thought about the woman he thought she had become. He opened her dresser drawers and put away her delicates after placing her clothes in her walk-in closet. Joe walked out of his former bedroom and back down to the servants' quarters. He entered the quarters and noticed Roberta on the couch. She called him over to her. He sat next to her and said, "I just put Susan's clothes away." Roberta looked at him for a second and said, "So? I am just her maid. You're just getting that now. I thought that would have hit you when she told Holmes about you." Joe nodded with a vacant look in his eyes. Roberta put her arm around him and said, "It's not so bad, is it?" A faint smile appeared on Joe's face as he thought about. He admitted, "This is one of my darkest fantasies. I always dreamed about being her maid. Not her husband, just her maid. I could never tell her. It's just a fantasy though. I never wanted it to come true. So at least this turns you on a little," Roberta said with a smile and a downward tilt of her head. "Yes. Well, it really turns me on a lot. I love to clean for her. I like being ordered about by Holmes even. I like the way he talks to me like I'm a servant. I'm glad I can't talk to our mistress. If I had to admit what I felt, I'd—" "You just called her your mistress," Roberta interjected. Joe paused and nodded. He replied, "I guess I'm accepting that." Roberta grinned and said, "Well, that was fast." "I guess so." Roberta leaned over and said, "I hope you weren't that fast in bed, but then that would explain why she made you the help." Roberta laughed a bit while Joe squirmed in his unease. "I feel tired," Joe blurted out. "That's to be expected. Go to bed. You've had a long day." Joe nodded and headed into his new bedroom. Joe crawled under his covers and stared around the dark room. A small amount of light was coming from under the door from the servants' living quarters. Joe realized that he was only the second servant to live in these quarters since he bought the home. He was the first to sleep in the room. It was his. Joe's worry was replaced with a small smile before he drifted to sleep. The next morning, Joe got up early and started to get ready for work. He had a longer walk to the nearest bus stop, as the area was not inhabited by those that took the bus. Joe walked past the homes of his longtime neighbors in silence. His head was down as he struggled to avoid eye contact with anyone on the street out of fear of possibly being recognized. He reached the stop and waited for the bus. The bus came and servants came pouring off the bus to walk in the direction he had come from. Joe headed onto the bus and transferred to another to get to work. He went to Ms. Winter's office and got his assignment. He worked his normal workday and headed back to Susan's home. There, Holmes let him eat dinner and then put him to work doing the remaining chores around the home. That became Joe's routine throughout the week. When Saturday came, Joe was surprised to see the bustling about when he got home. Holmes informed him that Susan had invited the board of directors over for a celebratory dinner. Joe asked what the celebration was for, but Holmes replied, "It doesn't matter, Maid. You don't ask questions. It's none of your concern. You just do as I tell you. Now, go into the kitchen and help Paul prepare the meals. Roberta left some bones for you to pick on for dinner. Although, you could certainly afford to skip a few meals." Joe put his head down and walked into the kitchen. He had grown used to Holmes' insults and learned to brush them off. Joe picked upon the leftovers of a roasted chicken that Roberta had left for him as he assisted Paul in making the meal. When he finished, Holmes ordered Joe to dress in the formal servant's attire that Roberta had left out for him in his quarters. Joe walked into the quarters and found his dress. It was simple black dress with a white apron. He disrobed and placed it on before putting on the black, 2-inch heeled shoes. Joe looked in the mirror to check his appearance. He froze as he began to think about all the familiar faces he was about to see. Roberta came into the quarters and caught the look on his face. She walked over to him and asked, "What's wrong, Mia?" "I know everyone I'm going to serve tonight." Roberta gave him a strange look and said, "Why does that matter?" Joe looked her in the eyes. Roberta sensed his panic. Joe answered, "What if one of them recognizes me?" Roberta laughed a bit before she said, "I wouldn't worry about that." "Why not?" "Look yourself in the mirror, sweetheart." Joe did as she said. He looked back at her. Roberta continued, "Do you even recognize yourself?" "A little bit, in the eyes, I guess." Roberta nodded and said, "They're not going to give you a second look. You're a maid, Mia. These important people don't give people like us the time of day. We're like the most unnoticeable furniture in the home. Nobody cares to notice us. We serve them and blend into the background. It's what we do." Joe looked at the ground and said, "Are you sure?" Roberta put her hand on his chin and met his eyes before she said, "Yes, I am sure. I've got plenty of experience to back it up. At these parties, only you ever looked directly at me, but we both know why that was." Joe smiled, feeling relieved by Roberta's statements. The first guests arrived and were directed by Holmes, who greeted them at the door. Joe was sent out to get the guests' drink orders. Joe asked them what they wanted and took a mental note. Joe quickly realized that none of them bothered to make eye contact with him. He realized that Roberta was right. He felt more confident and headed into the kitchen to make up their drinks. He went to carry them out by hand, but Paul stopped him. He gave him a serving tray and told him to carry them out. Joe carried the drinks out like a waitress and presented them to the guests. The guest took the drinks with the occasional muttered thanks. As dinner time came, Joe helped bring the food out to the table with Roberta. They stood at opposite ends of the table after serving the guests dinner. They waited for a guest to ask for something or Susan to order them about. Joe put his head down as he heard the people he voted onto the board talking about the business of his former company. They cheered Susan for the company's latest acquisition. Joe watched as they heaped praise upon her and ignored his presence just as they ignored Roberta's. He looked at Susan and noticed how she delighted in his anonymity among these men who trembled before her. Joe fetched his former associates' drinks and served seconds onto their plates at their request. After dinner, Joe and Roberta cleared the table and brought out the dessert. Roberta stayed and served them as Joe began to clean the dishes and wrap up the leftovers. Joe turned off the sink after washing his hand and assisted Roberta in bringing out the coffee and tea for the guests on trays. He felt emasculated as he bent before those that once nominally looked to him for guidance to let them take their drinks. Joe did not know why, but something about serving them coffee instead of liquor or wine made him feel even more like a maid. When they finished their desserts, the board members started to make their way out of the house. As the last guest left the home, Susan smiled at Roberta. Joe wiped down the table while Susan moved closer to Roberta. They exchanged a few words before Susan went to the living room. She called out, "Mia, get in here." Joe heard her shout and froze for a moment. He took a few deep breaths as he walked towards the living room with his cleaning rag still in his hand. He put his hands in front of him as he saw Susan lounging on the couch. Her stocking-covered legs were piled one on top of the other and crossed. Susan looked at him as she dangled her heels from her toes. Susan stared directly into his eyes and said, "Mia, I heard you were a bad girl around my guests." "No, madam. I wasn't. I was a good girl," Joe protested. "Don't lie to me, girl. I can't stand for my help to be cute with my guests." "No, madam. I swear. I wasn't cute. I was too scared to be. I wouldn't do anything more than needed." "Oh, so you didn't give your best efforts tonight?" Susan said in a stern voice that chilled Joe to his bones. Joe put his head down knowing his protests were in vain. Susan called him over to her. "Over my knee." "What?" Joe asked, unsure what she was demanding. "Lay over my knee so you can be spanked," Susan said as she moved towards the edge of the couch. Robert blushed and complied with her command. He wanted to run, but he could not disobey her. He positioned himself over her lap. He waited for her hand to strike him. He grew excited at the thought. Susan felt it and said, "Oh, so Mia, I see you like being punished." "No, madam," Joe said out of fear of what she might do if he admitted it. Susan raised her hands in menacing manner. Susan felt Joe begin to shake and started to laugh. Roberta came out from the next room laughing as well. Joe turned his head towards Susan. Susan smirked and said, "I got you good." "Got me? You didn't really think I destroyed all your records and was trying to force you into a lifetime of servitude? Hell, I've got that from you since before we married." Joe blushed and got off her lap. Susan continued, "It was a ruse, Joe. You fell for it so bad." Joe said, "Well, I'm glad it's a ruse, but it was a little cruel of you. What if one of them recognized me?" "That wouldn't happen." "How can you be so sure?" "Holmes recognized me." Susan shook her head and said, "I didn't even recognize you at the hotel. Holmes would never have recognized you either. I told Roberta, Paul, and Holmes about you beforehand. They knew you were coming and would be a maid." "How could you tell them?" "What if they tell someone?" Susan smiled and said, "They won't. I've bought their silence. They'd forfeit a fortune if they ever talked about your dressing." Joe nodded and said, "Well, do you still love me?" Susan's smile went away as she said, "Of course. I was just playing with you, Joe. I've got to get my thrills somehow now that you can't pee standing up. Did you think that you were the only person affected by that smoothness between your legs?" Joe blushed and shook his head. He collected himself and said, "Well, what do we do now?" Susan's smile returned as she answered, "You keep living here and working as my maid in the evening like always. Your days are all that have changed. Instead of working at the office, you'll be cleaning at the hotel. You really want me here like this?" Joe said as he pointed at his fake body parts. Susan nodded and said, "I like having you around, Joe. Even if you're more like a Ken doll than yourself when it comes to the husband stuff right now." Joe smiled as his eyes hit the floor. He knew that his wife knew his desires very well and knew how to push his buttons. He knew they were made for each other. He looked up at his wife and said, "Now, this is out in the open. Is there anything I can get for you tonight, madam?" Susan smirked at Joe and said, "Yes, draw me a bath and get me a glass of wine." "Yes, madam," Joe said with a smile.